Ka mihi mahana. I'm Sylvia Nissen from Lincoln University, and this is Raven Cretney from Waikato University. We are delighted to be joining you today from Aotearoa New Zealand to speak about the climate emergency declarations. We want to extend a particular thank you to the conference organisers for this opportunity. Climate change activism has long evoked emergency claims that time for action to avoid catastrophic futures is running out. Recently, these narratives have escalated significantly, with calls for panic joining the usual calls for urgency and drastic action. In this context, Extinction Rebellion has risen to prominence, pushing the message of climate and ecological emergency. Their action has initiated a wave of emergency declarations around the world. So it's in this context that we seek to explore and understand with greater nuance and with first-hand experience how emergency politics might be enacted in the context of climate change.
Climate emergency declarations are a contested feature of climate politics. On the one hand, they have become a focal point for the aspirations for instigating radical and urgent change in response to climate change. By this account, the emergency declarations hold the potential to break complacency and breach the boundaries of normal politics. They are also framed as a tangible focus for local climate movements to build awareness and engagement for action. On the other hand, critics caution that looking to crisis to facilitate political change fails to fully engage with its risks. Emergency politics can be a tool to consolidate the power of the state or other interests in the name of crisis, enabling securitization and excessive use of executive powers. Emergency can also foreclose opportunities for democracy and citizen participation, particularly among those already experiencing the injustice and inequalities of capitalism and colonialism. Climate emergency declarations then sit at the intersection of a promise of political space for change and the risks that emerge from crisis-led approaches. Within these debates, there are important nuances to be recognized. As Bonnie Honig reminds us, just as there are a variety of emergencies, there are a variety of approaches to emergency. As such, there are questions to ask around how a long-term climate emergency is being imagined and operationalized at a local scale.
Like many parts of the world, Aotearoa New Zealand has seen a rapid growth in climate emergency declarations. Local Extinction Rebellion chapters, alongside other activists, have called on leaders of local governments to declare a climate emergency. Our focus in this paper is on the emergency declarations of two local councils, Environment Canterbury and the Christchurch City Council. Both are situated in the Canterbury region of the South Island. They were among the first to declare a climate emergency in New Zealand in mid-2019. But they're also interesting because they have recent and direct experience with emergency governance. This includes a severe series of earthquakes in 2010 and 2011, as well as local wildfires, floods and drought in the decades since. Then, a few months prior to the declarations in 2019, there were two terrorist shooting attacks at mosques in the city.
Our study examines how these two local councils have sought to operationalise and implement climate emergency declarations. Our intent was not to gain an overview of the wider range of views on the declarations, but instead to focus on understanding how different actors involved at the institutional level perceive its possibilities, limitations, and potential long-term implications. We carried out 10 in-depth interviews with individuals involved in the emergency declarations in late 2019 and early 2020. Between 6 to 9 months following the emergency declarations. 2 were activists, 4 were councillors, and 4 were staff members. Document analysis was also undertaken through the collection of relevant recordings of council debates, policy, and media reports. These mixed qualitative sources allowed for a range of experiences of the emergency declarations, with some participants having advocated for the approach, while others were more reluctant or sceptical.
At both councils, the process of declaring a climate emergency progressed really rapidly. At Environment Canterbury, following a protest outside the council's offices, a decision was made to take the emergency declaration to the next council meeting. As one participant recounted, quote, "We got there in 2 weeks and it wasn't that hard." The Christchurch City Council made their declaration a week later. The process was described by officials as being very quick, following meetings between activists and some councillors. Officials recounted a sense of, quote, global pressure and rush to declare an emergency. There was also a belief that declaring an emergency was necessary to release a pressure valve.
For many participants, the climate emergency declarations were a source of hopeful action. The meaning and potential pin to them was multifaceted among interviewees. This included a belief that the climate declaration was 1, a wake-up call, a means to publicly inform and acknowledge the severity and urgency of climate change. 2, an ideal that offered a sense of purpose and direction for local councils. 3, a starting point or a belief that the climate declarations might become more significant over time by beginning something, although it was not always clear what this was. And finally, a line in the sand, providing a reference point that could be used for future leverage and accountability. However, despite these hopes, most councillors and officials considered the impact of the declarations to have been minimal. For instance, describing the declarations as having, quote, zero impact, no substance, and no teeth. This was also reflected in media statements. For instance, after Environment Canterbury's declaration, a councillor said, quote, nothing spectacular happens from here, it's business as usual as far as we're concerned.
What is interesting about the Canterbury case studies is that this gap between aspiration and action did not appear to be a matter of insufficient effort on the part of practitioners. Rather, it seemed to be a symptom of a series of tensions that emerged when the international language of climate emergency declaration was operationalised within a local context. 3 tensions stood out in particular. The first tension was the challenge of defining a climate emergency relative to other emergencies. As mentioned earlier, the Canterbury region has experienced a number of traumatic events in recent years. In this context, applying the term emergency provoked conflicts with existing emergency management responsibilities, but it also provoked wariness that the language of emergency might be inflammatory. As one official put it, quote, the terrorist attack had only just happened and there we were trying to use the word emergency. As a result, officials and many councillors carefully distinguished the climate emergency from other types of emergency. One explained to us, we wrote in the council paper, it's not this and it's not that. Yet this process essentially created declarations that were full of caveats. One explained, quote, we scaled down what it meant in order to completely differentiate it, so we splattered a whole lot of water over it.
A second tension was how a local council with limited jurisdiction might respond to the global emergency of climate change. Most of the councillors and officials interviewed were acutely aware of the limitations of local government's scope and capacity, for instance, speaking about having limited levers to pull. In this regard, officials and councillors tended to take a pragmatic approach that the declaration could not shift these boundaries. The terms of the climate declarations were worded in ways that ensured the council did not step beyond their legislative mandate, again maintaining the status quo.
The third tension related to doubts that an emergency declaration was appropriate to assist the difficult transformations required in the region in a changing climate. There was often a temporal aspect to these concerns, how the implied immediacy of emergency might interact with the long-term consistent transition required in a changing climate. There was also wariness that the lens of emergency may compromise collaborative social change, including engagement with Ngai Tahu, which is the iwi or tribal authority within the region, as well as with local citizens. As one councillor summarised, quote, I'm not sure emergency is the right frame to have that discussion.
These 3 tensions that emerged in the implementation of climate emergency declarations in Canterbury complement and add detail to wider discussion on climate emergencies. Activists in these case studies sought to reappropriate the idea of emergency to disrupt the status quo politics in response to climate change. However, despite genuine efforts, the councillors and officials found it difficult to overlay an existing and contested emergency governance approach to climate change.
These difficulties did not appear to be a matter of insufficient effort, and nor should it be a call for more emergency. Rather, it points to a more fundamental challenge of retrofitting an emergency approach to the climate crisis. Emergency governance is already contested in response to sudden onset disasters and hazards. Apart from having legislative responsibilities in these areas, many of the councillors and staff in Canterbury, often through direct experience, were acutely aware of these negative effects. In addition, many practitioners struggled to apply the international language of emergency for approaching the unprecedented scale, complexity, and temporality of climate change. This experience suggests that overlaying a concept as contested as emergency-style governance to respond to a problem as complex as climate change can reproduce status quo politics. Of course, these are only 2 case studies, and it's also early days. Perhaps these declarations will serve as a seed for future action. But our findings raise questions of the desirability of emergency approaches for instigating climate action. They also point to the need for more varied empirical research into how emergency approaches are being adapted in different contexts, and provide a prompt to explore tangible alternatives for fostering urgency without emergency to confront unprecedented ecological and political challenges. Thank you.